Hello class, this is Mr. Mormon. Today we're going to be doing part 2 of the organic molecules lesson. Yesterday we did an introduction to organic molecules and we talked about the first classification of organic molecules, which are carbohydrates. Today we'll talk about lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. So let's start with a definition of lipids. Lipids are made of long fatty acid chains bonded to a glycerol molecule. If you look at this diagram here, you can see these long chains. Those are the fatty acids, and they're connected to this glycerol molecule. Lipids are made mostly from carbon and hydrogen atoms, as you can see in the diagram. There's also some oxygens in there, but it's mostly carbon and hydrogen. Some different categories of lipids would be fats, oils, and waxes. In living things, lipids have different uses. They're mostly used to store energy. Fat, for example, in animals is a store of energy. Fat is also important for animals as insulation. Lipids are also part of certain biological membranes. Here we see a model of a cell, and if I expand this, you can see it a little bit better. The cell membrane is on the outside of the cell. That's the layer on the outside. If we look at this image, which is a blow-up of that membrane, we can see that there's lipids. This lipid bilayer is an important part of the membrane. And you see all these little kind of orange molecules here with these strands that go in. Those are the lipid molecules. And it's in two layers. That's why it's called a lipid bilayer. Lipids can also be waterproof coatings for some organisms, like we see on the waxy layer on the surface of these leaves or these cactuses. Lipids can also be chemical messengers. Steroids are an example of lipids. Lipids can also be classified as being saturated or unsaturated. If each carbon atom in a lipid's fatty acid chain is joined to another carbon atom by a single bond, the lipid is said to be saturated. The term saturated is used because the fatty acids contain the maximum possible number of hydrogen atoms. If there is at least one carbon-to-carbon double bond in a fatty acid, the fatty acid is said to be unsaturated. Lipids whose fatty acids contain more than one double bond are said to be polyunsaturated. If the terms saturated and polyunsaturated seem familiar, you've probably seen them on food packaging labels. Lipids such as olive oil, which contains unsaturated fatty acids, tend to be liquid at room temperature. Cooking oils such as corn oil, sesame oil, and peanut oil contain polyunsaturated lipids. If we go back to this diagram, which we saw earlier, we can try to figure out what kind of a lipid we're looking at here. Now, this is olive oil. And we can see here these double bonds that we were talking about, and we see that there's actually several of them, so this would be considered a polyunsaturated fat. If these double bonds here were broken and hydrogens were, so that they were just single bonds, and hydrogens were put in for, in these missing spots, that would be a saturated fat. Okay, next we're going to talk about nucleic acids. Now, at first that might not seem familiar to you, but I bet you know a little bit more about nucleic acids than you think. DNA. We've all heard of DNA before. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is a nucleic acid. So is RNA, ribonucleic acid. Nucleic acids are macromolecules containing hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. Nucleic acids are polymers assembled from the individual monomers known as nucleotides. Nucleotides consist of three parts: a 5-carbon sugar, a nitrogenous base, and a phosphate group. These nucleotides are strung together in long chains that make up the nucleic acid. If it's a single strand, that would be RNA. They can also be double-stranded, and that's DNA. The job of nucleic acids is to store and transmit hereditary or genetic information. Your genes are made up of nucleic acids, and this is how information is passed from generation to generation. This is how inheritance works. This year, we'll be talking a lot about both RNA and DNA, the two types of nucleic acids. As their names indicate, RNA contains the sugar ribose and DNA contains the sugar deoxyribose. And last, but certainly not least, we need to talk about proteins. Proteins contain nitrogen as well as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They are polymers of molecules called amino acids. Here's a diagram that shows the structure of some amino acids. All amino acids have an amino group at one end and a carboxyl group at the other end. Here you see with this greenish color the amino group and this turquoise color the carboxyl group. Notice that each amino acid has that. Now what distinguishes one amino acid from the other is what is attached to the central carbon here. We call that the R group. You can see here in alanine there's a carbon and 3 hydrogens. Serine, it's a little bit different. Instead of a hydrogen in this position, it's an OH, an oxygen and a hydrogen. This figure shows one reason why proteins are among the most diverse macromolecules. There are more than 20 different amino acids found in nature. All amino acids are identical in the regions where they may be joined together by covalent bonds. This uniformity allows any amino acid to be joined to any other amino acid by bonding an amino group to a carboxyl group. Now we're going to see this in a lab that we're going to be doing, but the way that it works, let's say this alanine was to combine with this serine or link up with it to start forming a protein. This bond would break and one of these hydrogen bonds would break. And that's called a dehydration synthesis because this OH and this H would each leave to form a water molecule. So that's why it's called dehydration. A water molecule will leave, and then this carbon would then bond right with that nitrogen, and these two would be linked together. And that can keep happening over and over and over again, creating these long chains and creating all sorts of different shapes. Now, the instructions for how these amino acids get linked together and the proper order that they go in to create proteins, those instructions are coming from DNA. That's what we were talking about just before, that DNA contains that hereditary or genetic information. Well, that information is literally the instructions on how to build proteins, how these amino acids get put together. Some proteins are structural, like the ones that form your muscles or bone or hair. And some control the rate of reactions within a living cell and regulate cell functions. These are very special proteins called enzymes. We're going to spend the whole next section talking about them. Some proteins transport substances in or out of a cell. Going back to this cell membrane diagram that I showed earlier, we can see here some proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. Here's a protein channel, which is going to help move things. Here's another protein molecule. Here's another protein molecule. They're part of the cell membrane, and their job is either in communicating information across the membrane or actually moving molecules in or out. Proteins also help in fighting disease. Antibodies are proteins. Now, it's important to remember that proteins have all of these different jobs, and it's because of their special shape. Each protein is going to have a special shape that allows it to do its specific task. Here we see an artist's drawing of a protein, and we can see the arrangement, the amino acids all being linked together according to the plan that was on the DNA molecule that gave the instructions. Um, by the order that they're put together, they'll start to twist and bend in different ways, forming all these different complex structures, allowing the protein to do its special job. Okay, that's enough for tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.